I do want to get started in a timely manner in respect to everybody's taking time out of their day to be here. So we only have a few rules. This is an open mic discussion, which means you get to talk too. So if you raise your hand and you have a comment, we're happy to unmute you and let you ask your question. You can stop at any time. You don't have to wait till the end. I'll stop periodically. If I forget to stop or I'm on a roll and I see the hand go up, or Gavin, you can stop me at any time. The idea is to create a discussion and a forum. And our team does a lot of research before these meetings. I try to present it in the best manner possible. And any questions that you don't feel as though you had answered during this discussion, we are wide open and you can follow up. And we'll get right to it. We try to have one, handout or discussion piece, kind of a thought leadership piece that we give you. We do in this discussion talk a little bit about TrackRef, but often we just try to talk about the topic. Not because we're not excited about TrackRef, but because we just want to make sure we make good use of your time. So I'm going to jump right in and let's get started. All right, so we're here today to talk about a really fascinating project that we did with University of Virginia, Darden Graduate School. And we worked with three really insightful, intelligent, and committed people who brought a very Darden solution to a global problem. And I say it that way because when we participate with Darden, it was as a result of an introduction that was made from a friend of ours who knew what we were trying to do. But I later learned that Darden's unique gift that they're able to pass on to all the students that come through is a very operational awareness about what the world needs for a solution, not just a theoretical, but an operational solution. And this is exactly where TrackRef sits, is at the operational edge of what's actually happening and what needs to happen and how those two worlds come together. So we're a lot more practical than we are theoretical, although we respect everything that we learn through the process. And the Darden graduate students who have now all gone on to very interesting careers. It was a very interesting process, but they brought us into their world and we brought them into ours, and we learned a few things, and we know that these things that we've learned still need to be developed. They're not done. The journey continues. So let me get in and talk about it. The goal here was to strategize a communication plan to promote ESG awareness. Now, when we started this project, the SEC had not released their Scope 1 reporting emissions responsibility requirements. They hadn't opened up the floor yet. We were aware that the SEC was considering it, but whether the SEC had considered this or not, we had taken this seriously for many years, and we believe that sustainability in the Scope 1 reporting space was being largely underreported and misunderstood. So we reached out to Darden to get their help in improving communication about the value of these shareholder documents and how organizations use them. And what we decided with Darden's guidance and involvement was to identify the stages that these companies were at so that we could better understand how to help them evolve to a point where they would find value in these ESG reports, find value if you're a shareholder, and find value if you're in management. Not just treat these as a marketing document, but really find value in some really deep operational information related to fugitive emissions. And then we also wanted to understand why companies at these various stages prioritized reporting and what was their motivation. And if we felt as if we could bridge the gap between all of those different pieces, that we could help companies on the journey to improve their reporting. All right, so there are actually 5 sections. I see number 5 down here at the bottom is missing. So the first section is a company map. We'll talk about that and what was driving things and we'll move on. Number 5 is really not completely evolved, but as a group with Darden, the Darden students, we determined that this is really the next part of the journey. All right, so we decided that, or it was decided, it was a group thing, and this project went on for about 8 months, that we should understand what the difference is in the maturity of companies related to their maintenance. What was the relationship between the maintenance program in the company and the maturity of their ESG disclosures? And we had a really broad group of companies to choose from. Some we worked with internally, and some we worked with externally, which means we just harvested public information. We worked with 50 companies internally on this, and a part of our process was to keep these companies anonymous. But what we found is the maturity issue stretched across all 50 companies. So we were able to find some common things, and we at first came up with a very simple rating structure, but eventually the Darden team developed a matrix, a quadrant. And you'll see here what the rating was for each of these quadrants. You know, whether they had external pressures, which are down at the bottom, or whether the internal awareness, how high it would rank. And we used a score of 1 to 9 because we had a lot more granularity on the external. It's not that we didn't want to have more granularity on the internal, but what we found in all of these evaluations were that internally, most companies did not have a strategic, mature maintenance program. Only 3% of companies, not our numbers. These are 3% surveyed of roughly 300 companies by Oxford University and Accenture, were determined to have a full maintenance maturity. And most of those companies were in the pharmaceutical world. So what we found is that number was so low, that the granularity was so low, and it didn't have a lot of density of information, and you'll see that in a minute, that we kept a ranking score of 5 instead of 9 or 10, which is really what we would have preferred. And you'll see the weight that we gave to each of these factors throughout the rating process. All right, let me see, did I get that right? All right, there we go. Sorry. All right, so some of the questions we asked for maintenance, for ESG maturity is, has the firm published an ESG report? And was that report publicly accessible? And then did they follow a particular framework, or did they have their own framework? And then was this ESG report part of their filing? Did they include it in their filing? And then lastly, did the firm that was under evaluation have a chief sustainability officer or an equivalent position? And if so, who did that person report to? Did they report to the CFO? Were they part of a marketing team? Most of the people were part of a marketing team. So if that helps at all, you'll find that really had a lot of weight on what happened or what we learned. Now, for the companies that we went to the public sources for, of course, all these companies had to have some form of an ESG report. And then they also had to have a 10K filing. So these were larger companies. Those companies are going to be on the next slide. And basically what we really wanted to understand in relationship to ESG maturity was, how did this relate to the way they accepted investments or disclosed investments? And so we looked at things like investors, financiers, consumers, industry, media, and regulators. And there it is. We did not interact with these companies directly. These companies, we harvested public information to see what did the public spectrum look like. Now you'll see our 1 to 10 rating across here. No one reached a 10. So, and the quadrants are, of course, start down here on the bottom, go to this quadrant 3. So it goes 4, 3, 2, 1. And I will tell you, this is very important to understand that HEB, based on this mapping, had nothing to do with their success or failure in the ESG world. If you'll notice, this had to do more with external pressure on HEB. It had nothing to do with HEB's skill set or any amount of resources applied to HEB's public disclosure. I think HEB does an amazing job. Everybody on this page strived to participate in the ESG disclosure world, and so they were really trying. But what this initial effort found was that there wasn't a lot of external pressure on HEB for ESG reporting. And the reason this is so significant is that initially, when we were analyzing this, the Darden team imagined or had created a hypothesis that external pressure was the driver for improved ESG disclosures. And that is the market accepted expectation. Okay, so this report would not rank you really well if you were a private company that did not have a public disclosure, but published an internal ESG report. You would not rank well on this. And the reason I'm sharing this, and I think it's so valuable, is that, for instance, a Kroger up here ranked as top quadrant, one of the highest, best performers, yet Kroger, through their own public disclosure, does not report HCFC emissions. They do not report emissions from ODS systems. So the value to this report was to help us understand where there were vulnerabilities in the market's perception about ESG disclosures related to internal company performance. I hope that makes some sense, because additionally, I can also point out that Delta Airlines published a report that only qualified about 100 pounds of emissions from Delta across, I don't know how many facilities, but a lot of facilities and a lot of airplanes. And so for a company the size of Delta Airlines to have the same global emissions reporting impact on their fugitive emissions related to refrigerants as a small convenience store seems out of bounds and really out of perspective. Okay. But what this showed us, the value to this report right here, is that using the market information and available market data and the leading edge thinking about why companies report, we were able to understand that there were large gaps between operational performance and ESG maturity. And so what we called this was, what we looked to call it was an ESG maturity rating based on maintenance maturity, and create a parallel there. Does anyone have any questions about this? I'm happy to answer them. I know I just explained a lot. I hope it made sense. Okay. Either I've bored everybody to death or I've dazzled you. Ooh. 1 second. Oh, there we are, slide 9, slide 10. Now, a high score for these people was high awareness and external pressure level. So pay attention to that, because this is what the vulnerabilities are to this report, not the qualities, but the vulnerabilities. And at the bottom here, you'll know strategic perspective. They had a highly integrated ESG goal in their business decisions. One of the new things we'll be looking at as we go forward, because this will continue into next year and for the long foreseeable future, is how tightly aligned are ESG goals with company bonuses. We found there is an alignment there, and in the companies that had alignment, it was a lot better performance and a lot better disclosure information. Which also led to a willingness to increase ESG investing. If you thought that an investment in your ESG success might also lead to an investment in your own bonus for the future. So that was a big piece of insight that we learned, and traits that we found amongst those high level A people. And some of the communication highlights were the idea of quantitative data and analysis to help with the decision making and improve the ESG related communication between stakeholders. So this group feels a lot more empowered to talk to shareholders about the results. They're happy to talk about them because they find that that's an important part of how they measure their own success. All right, I'm gonna keep going. Now, high A, low P, going back to the chart, these again, high awareness, but low external pressure. They start to integrate the goals into their decisions. They're not leaders, right? This other group in group one, that group are the leaders. This group is kind of trailing behind. They don't want to be on the bleeding edge of this issue, but they don't want to be left behind either. And they might find that widgets do a lot of the measuring for them, but they don't have the internal resources to understand the widgets. Data analysis or maybe analysis paralysis might be an issue with this group right here. But they have the potential to meet the new SEC requirements. And they also have a willingness to do that. So this group wants to be successful, and they're happy to make these investments. They just are a lot more careful about how they do it. And this group does not want to be perceived as greenwashing. It's very important. Now, the next group,
we have a question.
All right, what do we have?
I'm not clear on why HEB was Q4 rather than Q2, if you don't mind coming back to that.
Yeah, so in the Darden evaluation for HEB, as I said, what we were using was market information, not real internal information. In none of these cases was any internal information shared with TrackRef or the Darden team. This determination was based on, as you can see right here, low external pressure and a low ESG awareness across their disclosure. What they disclosed did not show a high level of awareness about what they were doing. Courtney, does that answer the question? Because it has nothing to do with what they're doing in performance. It only has to do what the disclosure showed, not what they did. So it's a great question. I just want to make that clear. Okay, I got to thank you, so I'll assume that covered that. Okay, so let's get down to the next one. Low A, high P. This group here, low awareness with external pressure. Maybe they're self-funded. Maybe they're a private family business. Maybe their funding comes from a different entity. In some cases, we found that, for instance, companies that were funded by European-based funding sources had a very different outcome that funding came from Asian or South American-based funding sources. And so we did pay close attention to these funding sources when we were making the evaluation. This group was slower on the way that they published ESG initiative results. Their efforts were mostly focused on compliance and brand. So that meant tighter navigational awareness about what's actually going on. This was not the creative group looking beyond the boundaries in the reports that they disclosed. Anybody here who's read through a lot of these reports, if you look at Dollar General's report, for instance, it's got one line item for everything, 2.8 billion tons of carbon, I think is the number, or pounds, I don't even remember, but it's just one line item. What you'll find in the group that was in the quadrant 4, the most successful group, is when they published information, it was highly granular. And it might not have been accurate, or we might not have believed it, but they made the effort to publish it. So this is in no way a reading on the accuracy or the quality, only what the disclosure published. We're going to get to why that's so important in a minute. Does that make sense before I move on? All right. Lastly, these were the low A, low P. This is the group in box one. These are the guys, the teams, the people that had a very low awareness and very low external pressure. And just to refresh your memory, because I should have put that slide on each one, Charles Schwab, Vanderbilt University, Advantix, Cushman Wakefield, and how they publish their information. They had a low awareness rating. Now, remember, the awareness rating is based on this right here. ESG reports, whether they adopted a framework, whether they had an SEC filing, and whether they had a chief sustainability officer. This is all very binary and very specific. It might not be based on what you're thinking a successful company is. And if you're a shareholder to these companies and you're looking at this discussion that we're hosting today, or you're looking at the value that Darden brought to this chart, you might want to make a few adjustments, because you can't get out of this quadrant unless you've scored yourself by having a disclosure, a framework, a chief sustainability officer, and I forget what number 4 is, and having a fully published ESG report. So if you have an ESG report, there you go, there's 1 point. Second point is framework. Third point is your SEC filing includes that in your 10K, and then you have a chief sustainability officer. So it's very important that you see how the ranking is developed. Now, we had a whole year, or 8 months, almost 9, and suggestions for these companies, if we were to make any, and we were to have that privilege or want to share it, or they even wanted to listen, would be to focus on why digital solutions would do a better job compared to some internal documentation like spreadsheets. In the second quadrant in particular, promote basic solutions and help them focus on benefits of sustainability. Key factors in the third quadrant are to go beyond that regulatory compliance and public image and really better understand not just how this looks outwardly, to the outward investment world, but how internally valuable that data is. We used an Accenture Oxford University report. We found a lot of value in this report. And what they found was that only about 9% of companies find value in these outward report pieces or information that's contained in these outward reports. And that's a really significant thing here, because if you're only doing this, only harvesting this information so that you can share it with the external world, you're missing the bulk of the value of that data to use internally to both improve operations, motivate staff, align your investments. The list is endless. But this feedback loop, if you skip it, and apparently 91% of companies are skipping that, you are missing the greater part of the value. And that's why what we came out with after Darden had time, the Darden team had time to research this, was that companies are missing the alignment between the aspirational goals and the operational performance of the company. And that is a great opportunity to talk about innovation and the ways to improve things. All right, next we're going to talk about our desktop research. This survey that I'm about to share with you, the next few slides, are actual results from surveys of working with individual companies. Now, I like to point out that the public comment period for SEC, actually it's been extended. Gavin, I think it's the 20th now, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, not the 9th, so my apologies. Here it's the 9th. And the finalized rule may be challenged in court, which could delay implementation. But I really want to make a point here that the reason we included this piece of information is that the people in quadrant 1 are not waiting for this activity on the screen to change how they disclose and report information and harvest it. They're already motivated to do those things. Quadrant 1 is in quadrant 1 because it has been part of their business DNA for more than a few years. So important note there. All right, so let's get in and look at these the results from these surveys. So ESG decisions in all of these cases were summarized into the screen that you see here. Consumer companies, ESG pressure mainly was from consumers. That was important to them. European exposure. The European frameworks are different than the US frameworks for reporting. I mean, the frameworks are the same, but the expectations are different. So for instance, EU taxonomy is a really big deal. We don't have time to go into that today, but companies that have operations in both continents and have a reporting responsibility will find that they are already more motivated than their peers for improving their reporting. Actually, in some of these surveys, that's where we found the most success, was where bonuses and awareness were all tied together. All right. Does that make sense? Has everybody had a chance to read that? Gavin, you think that's enough time?
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right, good. So let's talk about the numbers. So what we did is we brought 21 companies. Not all 21 of these companies were TrackRef clients. As a matter of fact, I believe most of them were not. And we asked those 21 companies, these are friends, people that we've worked with in the past, or we have some relationship with. We asked them to participate. What we found is these were larger companies. Most of them were over 1,000 employees. So these are bigger firms. We had 21 companies that were in hospitality, grocery, and the chemical space. And the people that they interviewed were in the legal compliance and operations side, whereas the peers that they talked to from the University of Virginia Darden team, with their group of registrants or people who participated in the survey, they were in the finance and sustainability role. And I think you're gonna find something very interesting when I show you these numbers. Again, these were larger firms. All right, not a lot of small companies here. Now, what did we find? First, reporting ESG on the TrackRef side, the group that we work with, they get an 80. They get a score of 80. And this is where we really start to see the most fascinating part of this Darden, let's call it campaign for awareness on ESG. The reason that their scores were high is because operationally, the sustainability goals were able to drill into better data. So their scores were up. They did fantastic. Their responsibility scores were 64. Whereas the group that, just came from the Darden team, who did not have any special operational awareness, they only scored a 41%. All right. Or 41% reported an ESG, and their responsibility score was about a 49. And their core investment area were compliance, sustainability, and market offerings. And what you'll find is operationally, the more you involved operations, the higher the ESG scoring would go. And so this was really fascinating. Now, none of the 50 or the 49 companies that we worked with were on that magic quadrant, that quadrant that we developed. None of them. We did that on purpose. We didn't want their information. We wanted to keep these two things separate because we wanted to see if this correlation between maintenance maturity and ESG maturity was real or not. So compared to last year, sustainability was up in both cases. Awareness is there. There we go. All right. Again, on these larger firms, we found that the reporting on the ESG, big companies versus small companies, bigger companies had a higher score, smaller companies, a lower score. The interesting thing is scope 3 emissions will make these force smaller companies to improve their scores, and they have a lot of work to do. They've got to get that maintenance maturity. That's the pump that you got to prime in order to get those ESG scores up. You've got to get into things like your energy bills and your fugitive emissions from your scope 1 related to your maintenance performance. your car and vehicle and transportation information. A lot of work to improve there, but they weren't really terrible. They scored a 44 on the responsibility score. So this pretty much speaks for itself, but I did find this very interesting. Third-party review of the companies that did participate over here, they were more likely to have a third party look over their numbers. And we believe, based on our answers that we received, that most of them had a third party do it, even though when I show you the next couple slides, you'll see a little bit more. It was likely that the third party was already gathering the information and therefore doing the audit. So they tended to outsource more, which makes sense. But the one thing that we did find, again, on the big companies that were surveyed, ESG involvement in decision-making was, sorry for that, usually did involve the maintenance and operations people. Are there any questions there? All right, we're going to go into actually show you some of the survey results, because this was really fascinating. Don't mind me if I look over at the screen. It's a little bit bigger than the small one I've got here. Third-party review, 8 out of 24, 30% of companies had a third-party review things. And you can see what the other answers were. 10 of the 24 skipped the question on the Darden side. So again, these are the Darden results here. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. Framework. 10 of the 24 skipped answering the question about framework. They just didn't have a reference point. Many of them didn't know. Many of them not adopted a framework. So if you're on this call and you're with a framework company, you got a lot of marketing to do, probably through some type of industry association. But it does show that there's a keen awareness by companies already engaged in the scope 1, but not those not engaged. So if you're not there, this is all part of that maintenance maturity that we shared with you earlier. All right, more large companies report ESG than small. Makes sense. It seems like an obvious result on the left side. The industries were fairly widely distributed. And I think the key to this is that we're really do a lot of work with grocery and some data center companies and some large international companies. But the survey results, these came really from a different round of people that we both don't work with, or we have a marginal relationship with, like an awareness. And then also the Darden group. But we had everything: semiconductor, hospitality, consulting, tech. It's all there. All right. I went backwards again by mistake. All right. Function in a company determines how they view sustainability, but they don't have a say in their ESG engagement. People felt left out. The most impacted industries, like you would think, oil and gas, they viewed sustainability negatively, which is unfortunate because sustainability reporting is not a measure of your quality as a company. It's a measure of your ability to produce accurate information. And I think that gets misunderstood a lot. We certainly heard that through the survey results. Of the 49 companies, I believe all 24 from Darden were done one-on-one, whereas all the TrackRef ones were done through an automated survey process. Also, it's important to know that regardless of the role, employee engagement was really rare. It was almost a secret in the company about how those reports were generated, or how the information was harvested, or even how the results were published. So I found that really important. And the fact that CFOs were rarely engaged was a big surprise, because they're the ones who, through this SEC update, will largely be responsible for disclosure. So there's a lot of work left to be done. Next steps with Darden. No, I do not have a guarantee, but we will be reaching out to Darden for the next curriculum year, and we have a lot to get working on. We're going to revisit the selected companies in group 1 and see how they rank in the second year. So that'll be very important to us. We want to see, as we improve our knowledge and granularity on our awareness granularity, how those companies then rank. And we'll be making some big changes to that quadrant. Companies within the group that have the same score face pressure for different sources. We're all competing for financing dollars. So what we found is that one of the most important reasons for engaging in SEC disclosures related to ESG reporting was related to finance. And they felt like this was an important disclosure for them to be accurate with. So we'll pay a little bit more attention to that in the next round. And the suggestion from the last group would be awareness should be tailored based on the different industries. So we might focus on a few industries in the next group. Then as far as European regulations go, this is a patchwork. The SEC's expectations are different than the EU's expectations. And so we're going to have to determine the impact of the variance and gaps between the two on both data and awareness internally to the companies. All right. The last one is something that we had not really fully built out the model for, but we feel comfortable with this. In the equipment maintenance world, the assumption is, you fix equipment, you have a budget, you make improvements. But there are scales along the journey. And what we found is, put highlights around this. If you're a fix it until it fails company, you probably don't have the tracking in place to deliver an ESG report or scope 1 report with any level of accuracy. It's just not in the data set that you have access to. We've seen this firsthand ourselves. And what we find is the fix it till it fails model for maintenance usually directly correlates to an exact failure or a very low maturity rating for the individual company. And so if you notice, we've developed 5 levels. We've merged a lot of data onto this chart. I would love to hear from anybody who's in the maintenance world or the operations world and wants to contribute to this evolution. I can give you an example of maturity issue. If all of your assets have the same 20 attributes, you probably don't have a mature asset registry. That'll be another thing that makes it here. Is that you don't have a tailored asset taxonomy structure for each group of assets. And this is the sustainability journey where you're leading and lagging KPIs. This is the group that might just report, but they don't use it internally. This is the next group. They're starting to use it internally to help make improvements. And this group up here, this is what they do. This is the top 3% of all companies. All right, right up here. And we merged all this information from a host of sources. So I hope you find it valuable. But we tailored some things in here and chose these 2 boxes to really highlight the alignment. If you're a fix it before it fails, maybe your assets are critically ranked. Maybe you do have a ranking system. Maybe you have a fixed time and preventative maintenance program in place. This is where you're doing your quarterly PMs and you say to yourself, well, that asset's reached 7 years old. We're just going to go ahead and make some changes to the asset to upgrade it. And maybe you've determined a risk-based preventative maintenance program and you're modeling asset performance. And then lastly, you have fully built out a condition-based and predictive maintenance program. These are the people that have the lowest leak rates, the best performing assets, the highest energy efficiency. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the statement, these are largely a lot of pharmaceuticals and that group where they have the time for that and they don't have the same type of constraints on them that the normal market does. Maybe we find our convenience stores out in this area. And why is this important? Well, if you're asking yourself that, you might not have done this before. But if you're looking at this and going, well, I've got some ideas, then you have done this before. If you are an investor and you are making an investment in a company that has one line on their balance sheet that says, this is my total carbon emissions, you might find that that company doesn't know what their emissions are per unit. And they don't know because they're doing a fix it as it fails maintenance model. And that maintenance model would lead you then to believe that maybe they don't have as much control over the maintenance and the equipment performance as they would like you to believe. And so that would be something you might want to take a look at. And if you are in one of these categories and you want to mature to the next one, what does that maturity look like? How do you make that leap? What are the incremental steps? Okay, that's all I've got. This was a big topic. I love the question, Courtney, earlier. I hope I did it justice. Does anyone have any other questions? Chase, Roya, anything you want to add? Well, that was too easy. That was way too easy. Gavin, do I need to include anything?
No, no more questions.
Okay, everybody, I hope I made great use of 45 minutes of your day. We'll get the recording published and we'll get the slides out to you. I really appreciate you joining. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.